What if something entered your body without your permission? Not a virus, not a disease. Something that knew exactly what it was doing. Something that had been watching you long before you ever saw it. This is the story of Marcos Vela, a man who went to work one night and never truly came back. In the spring of 2019, a security guard working the night shift at a bottling plant on the outskirts of Monterrey, Mexico, began experiencing something he could not name. It did not begin dramatically. There was no single moment of rupture, no event he could point to and say, "This is where it started." Instead, it crept in slowly, the way illness does when the body has already decided to surrender before the mind catches up. His name was Marcos Vela. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and had worked the same overnight shift for 6 years. He was not a man given to imagination. His colleagues described him as quiet, reliable, the kind of person who showed up early and left without conversation. He lived alone in a small, rented room on the eastern edge of the city, where the streets narrowed and the lights came less frequently and the sound of distant dogs carried through the walls at night. His routine was simple. He slept through the mornings, woke in the early afternoon, ate whatever was available, and arrived at the plant before 11. He had done this for so long that the hours no longer felt strange to him. Darkness was simply the backdrop of his life, not something he feared or questioned. That changed in March of 2019. It began with reflections, not in mirrors, but in glass. Factory windows, the dark surface of his phone screen when it went idle, the passenger window of the bus he took home each morning as the city was waking up around him. In these surfaces, Marcos began to notice a shape standing behind him. It was never there when he turned around. He dismissed it at first. 6 years of night shifts had a way of bending the mind at the edges. Sleep deprivation produces its own quiet hallucinations, shadow figures at the periphery, sounds that dissolve before they can be identified. He told himself this was all it was. But the shape in the reflections did not behave the way hallucinations do. It did not flicker or distort. It stood with a stillness that felt deliberate, a patience that suggested it was not responding to him, but simply waiting. And it was always the same shape. Short, narrow at the shoulders, a head that seemed slightly too large for the body beneath it. By the second week of March, Marcos had stopped looking at reflective surfaces altogether. He rerouted his walk through the plant to avoid the large factory windows on the east side of the building. He kept his phone face down. He told no one. On the night of the 21st of March, Marcos was alone in the monitoring room at the rear of the plant. It was a small space, one desk, one chair, a bank of security screens showing empty corridors and loading bays, a single fluorescent light overhead that buzzed faintly when the temperature dropped. At 2:47 in the morning, every screen went dark simultaneously. Marcos sat forward. Power outages at the plant were not unheard of, but they were never silent. A full outage brought noise, the groan of machines winding down, the click of backup systems engaging. This was different. The screens simply stopped, as though whatever they had been looking at had decided it no longer wished to be seen. The fluorescent light continued to buzz. Marcos reached for his radio. Before he could lift it, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Not gradually, not the slow chill of an open door, but instantly, as though the air itself had been replaced. He and watched his breath cloud in front of him. Then he heard it. A low sound, not quite a hum and not quite a voice, something between the two, resonating not through his ears but somewhere behind them, as though the sound was occurring inside his skull rather than outside it. He did not move. The sound lasted approximately 40 seconds. When it stopped, the screens returned. Every corridor empty, every loading bay undisturbed. Marcos sat in the silence for a long time before he picked up his radio again. He did not report what had happened. 3 nights later, he saw it in the room with him. He had not fallen asleep. He was certain of this. He had been awake, filling out an incident log for a minor equipment fault reported earlier in the shift, his pen moving across the paper, his mind present. He became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound that has been there for some time before you consciously register it. It was standing in the far left corner of the monitoring room, the same shape from the reflections. Short, narrow, the head slightly disproportionate. But now, without glass between them, Marcos could see more. Its skin had a texture he struggled to describe later. Not smooth, not scaled, but layered, as though whatever covered its surface had accumulated over a very long time. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were dark and wide and without any visible boundary between iris and pupil. They did not blink. Marcos did not scream. He did not run. He would later say that the thought of doing either simply did not occur to him, as though those options had been quietly removed from the available choices without his noticing. Instead, he sat very still and looked at it. And it looked at him. For what he estimated was between 3 and 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then it moved towards him, slowly, without sound, covering the distance between the corner and his chair in a way that did not quite match the mechanics of walking. It stopped directly beside him, and then it pressed one hand flat against the side of his neck.
The sensation was not pain. It was pressure, deep and total, as though something was passing through the skin rather than pressing against it. Marcos described it later as feeling like a door being opened inside him, not violently, but with the quiet certainty of someone who already had the key. It lasted only a few seconds. When the hand withdrew, the figure was gone. Not gone as in having left through a door or moved out of sight, simply gone, as though it had stepped out of the visible world entirely. Marcos sat without moving for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The screens showed empty corridors. His incident log was still open in front of him, his pen resting across the page. He finished filling out the form, completed his shift, and took the bus home as the city woke around him. He did not sleep that day. Not because he was afraid, but because every time he closed his eyes, he became aware of something he could not locate or identify. A presence that was not outside him, but not entirely him either. Something that had not been there before. Something that was settling in. The changes began within days. They were subtle at first, easy to attribute to exhaustion or stress, or the accumulated strangeness of what he had witnessed. His appetite shifted. Foods he had eaten his entire life suddenly tasted wrong. Not unpleasant exactly, but incorrect, as though his palate had been recalibrated to a set of preferences he did not yet understand. He found himself eating less, and then almost nothing at all, and yet he was not hungry. His sleep, when it came, was different, deeper than it had ever been, but not restful. He would wake with the feeling that hours had passed in which he had been somewhere else entirely, doing something he could not remember, for purposes he could not name. His coworkers noticed something too, though none of them said so directly. They simply began to leave more space around him. Conversations that would have included him trailed off before he arrived. Eyes that met his looked away slightly faster than they used to. Marcos noticed this, but found he did not mind. What concerned him more was the mirror in his bathroom. He had begun avoiding it for the same reason he had avoided reflective surfaces at the plant. But one morning in early April, he forced himself to look. His face was the same. His eyes were the same. Almost. There was something in the quality of his gaze that he did not recognize. A stillness that had not been there before. A patience that felt ancient and unhurried and not entirely his own. He stood there for a long time looking at himself, or at whatever was looking back. He visited a doctor in the second week of April, not because he felt unwell, but because he understood, on some level that was becoming harder to access, that this was what a person in his situation was supposed to do. The doctor found nothing wrong. Blood pressure normal, reflexes normal, no signs of infection or neurological irregularity. When Marcos described the changes in his appetite and sleep, the doctor suggested stress and shift work disruption, both reasonable explanations that Marcos accepted without argument. He did not mention the figure in the monitoring room. He did not mention the pressure at his neck. He did not mention the thing he had seen in his own eyes in the bathroom mirror. On his way home from the clinic, he passed a stray dog sleeping in a doorway. The dog woke as he approached. It did not bark. It did not growl. It pressed itself flat against the ground and watched him pass with the particular stillness of an animal that has identified something it cannot categorize and has chosen, wisely, not to engage with it.
Marcos watched the dog for a moment. Then he continued walking. He noticed, without particular alarm, that his shadow fell at an angle that did not match the position of the sun. By May, the transformation had moved beyond the internal. It was a colleague named Dario who first said something aloud. He pulled Marcos aside near the end of a shift, in the corridor outside the monitoring room, and asked him plainly if he was all right. Marcos said yes. Dario looked at him for a long moment, and then said something Marcos would think about for weeks afterward. He said that Marcos no longer walked the same way. Not that he walked strangely, not that he limped or shuffled, but that the way he moved through a room had changed in a way Dario could not describe, only notice. As though, he said, as though the space around you knows you're coming. Marcos thanked him and returned to his desk. That night, alone in the monitoring room, he sat in front of the dark screens during a routine system restart and looked at his reflection in the black glass. The shape was there again, standing behind him, exactly as it had appeared in the weeks before the encounter. But this time, when he looked more carefully, he realized something that turned the remaining warmth in the room to nothing. The shape was not standing behind him. The shape was him. What he had been seeing in reflections for weeks was not a visitor. It was a preview. He stopped going to work in the third week of May, not because he quit, but because one morning he simply did not leave his room. And the following morning, he did not either. And by the time anyone thought to check on him, 4 days had passed. It was Dario who came. He knocked twice, received no answer, and let himself in with the spare key Marcos had given him years ago for emergencies. What he found was not an emergency exactly. Marcos was seated in the center of the room, on the floor, in the dark, facing the wall. He was breathing, he was conscious, but when Dario spoke to him, Marcos turned his head slowly, and Dario later told the people who came asking questions that in that moment he did not feel as though he was looking at his colleague. He felt as though he was being assessed. Dario called for help. When the paramedics arrived, Marcos cooperated fully. He stood when asked, walked when directed, answered questions in a calm and measured voice. He was admitted for psychiatric observation. The doctors found no psychosis, no dissociation, no chemical imbalance that explained his behavior. After 72 hours, with no clinical basis for continued detention, they released him. He returned to his room alone. No one saw Marcos Vela again after the 4th of June 2019. His room was found empty. His belongings were undisturbed. His food, what little remained, had not been touched. His phone was on the table, battery dead, no outgoing calls in the final 11 days. There was no sign of struggle, no indication he had packed or planned to leave. The door had been locked from the inside. Dario was the one who filed the missing persons report. He was also the one who, months later, began telling people what he had seen in those final weeks, quietly to those he trusted, because he felt that silence was no longer something he could afford. He described the changes in Marcos, the walk, the eyes, the shadow that fell wrong. And he described one final detail he had not included in any official account. On the night he found Marcos seated on the floor, before he called for help, he had stood in the doorway for almost a full minute, watching. And in that minute, he had seen Marcos turn his head toward the wall. And on the wall, in the dark, without any light source to explain it, there was a shadow. Not Marcos's shadow, a different one. Short, narrow at the shoulders, a head slightly too large for the body beneath it. Moving slowly, deliberately, as though it was no longer a shadow at all, but a reflection of what Marcos was becoming, what Marcos, by then, had already become. They did not find his body. They did not find him at all. But 3 months later, a security guard at a processing plant 40 kilometers outside the city reported something strange. A shape in the factory windows, standing very still, always behind whoever was looking, always gone when they turned around, always waiting.